Hello, Namaste. Welcome to Dev's Hammer Show. This is weekly English talk show on Indigenous television and ITV Nepal. In this talk show, we feature in-person and sometimes online interviews with guests from diverse backgrounds. We discuss on Indigenous issues affecting Indigenous peoples worldwide. We share the experiences and foster a connection between the communities. Today I have a very special guest from Mexico. He is Indigenous but teaching sociology. He's a professor of sociology teaching sociology in Canada. So today we will basically discuss about the Indigenous peoples in general in Mexico, as Indigenous peoples of Mexico have a similar history, similar struggles that Indigenous communities in Nepal are facing. So his name is Hinar. He's a professor, and first of all, I would like to welcome Hinar in my show. Welcome.
Dhanyavad. Nibolal in my language. Thank you for inviting me.
So Hinar, as I said, I picked up your first name only. Your
Yeah.
last name is a little difficult. And could you just introduce yourself, as I said, only a professor of sociology and an Indigenous person from Mexico? Could you introduce yourself a bit to start with our conversation?
Sure. My full name is Hinar Llanes Ortiz. I'm a Yucatec Maya person, which means that I come from the Yucatan Peninsula. My ancestors are perhaps some of the best-known indigenous people from Mexico, the Maya, the ancient Maya civilization. We come from that same civilization, and we have lived in the territory that we now call the Yucatan for thousands of years, as many other indigenous peoples in the world. I am a professor, as you said. I was trained as an anthropologist. I did my PhD studies in the United Kingdom, University of Sussex, and then since finishing my PhD, I've been lucky to work and travel in different parts of the world. I have worked in the UK, I've worked in the Netherlands, worked in my home country, and I'm currently working in Canada as a professor at Bishop's University, which is a small liberal arts college in southern Quebec, which is a French-speaking province, and we are one of only 3 universities in the province of Quebec where English is the main language of teaching and learning. So I have been living in this part of the world in the last 3 years, and as a professor, I am in charge of teaching courses like digital media and society, or the history of colonization and decolonization to my students. But my main focus of research is on what I call digital indigeneities, which is how indigenous people in the world use and adapt indigenous technologies to further their own objectives and agenda.
So we'll basically cover about your subject, as you said, indigeneity, data sovereignty, and so forth later on. But as you said, when you talked about your background or indigenous connectivity, Yucatec and Mayan indigenous peoples, but I have heard a lot about Mayan indigenous peoples are also in Guatemala, in other parts of the country, besides the other part of the world, besides the Mexico. Are they also same indigenous communities, or are they different? And if they are different, in what sort, or if there are similarities, what are the commonalities are there?
In some ways, we are very similar, but at the same time, we speak very different languages. So when we talk about Maya peoples, the main thing we have to remember is that the Maya languages are a very big family of languages, right? So we're talking about between 30 and 32, maybe 33 different languages that call themselves Maya languages.
Within Mexico alone?
Mexico, Guatemala, Belize, parts of Honduras, parts of El Salvador. So we are very diverse group of people.
Mayan. the particular Mayan.
Exactly. So we all belong to the Mayan family of languages. In some ways, if I can use a comparison, it will be like, think about the Sanskrit family of languages, right? So you have Bangla, you have Bengali, you have Urdu, you have Hindi, you have Nepali, and many others that are different and at the same time are related to some extent, right? In the case of the Maya languages, our languages are very different. Like Russian is different to English, or like Italian is different to Danish. But we all belong to the same family of languages.
You're talking different in terms of Mayan. Within a Maya, there is different dialects, or the Yucatan?
Different languages altogether. As I said, if you, as a speaker of English, which is an Indo-European language, you cannot understand French, or you cannot understand Russian, for instance. So, as a speaker of Yucatec Maya, I cannot understand Tzotzil, or Quiche, or Quechí, or Chorti. There are very different languages, all within the family of the Maya languages.
So you said Yucatec Mayan language that you speak. How does it listens? Could you just speak certain words
Yes,
in
no.
Yucatec Mayan?
Absolutely. Upahtalin Walektech, Tene Inkahale, Ukabae, Kul, Tene Sigente Le Kahalo. Uchcache, yanten 51 hab tile ikil sigen tile kahoba tile kaho ilmeya hechuntu alcanza kinkansi que helas balo tu nohlumil Canada ichil u Unahil Shock Ukabae Bishops.
What did you say? You introduce yourself.
Yes, I was introducing myself. I was just saying that I am from the Yucatan, and that the name of my town is Tikul, and that I was born in Tikul 51 years ago, and that currently I'm working as a professor at a university in Canada. That's called Bishops.
But in Yucatan Mayan language, as I listened, there are some clicks, and some African languages also have clicks in there.
Yeah,
that sounds really interesting.
Yeah, there are more than clicks. I mean, yeah, the African languages have clicks, but the sounds that we make in our language are so. A South African friend was explaining me this the other day. Click tongues. You put your tongue on the roof of your mouth. In our case, we make the sound with the back of our throat. So we say for instance, Kaaba, which means name, and then but we also have sounds like Tib, we make with the teeth. That means writing. Then we also have Po, which means cleaning or washing, and that's with the lips. And then we have Tan, which is language, and finally I'm trying to think of the other. We have 5 consonants that have this click sound. And then I think Tan, O, Tib, Kag. And there's one that I'm forgetting right now, but it'll come back to me.
We also have similar, not similar, but some not clicks. My Sunuwar. I come from Sunuwar Indigenous community or nationalities. We don't use the word communities.
Mm-hmm.
We use the Indigenous nationalities, right,
Okay.
in Nepal.
Mm-hmm.
So we also have some similar, but we use more with the nasal one, right?
Mm-hmm.
And then just like as you said, we also have word like.
Mm-hmm.
Right, but we don't have any wordings in Nepali, but we
Yeah.
use that one for spatial. That one.
I just remember what is the 5th consonant that is glottal. They are called glottal consonants, and is which we also make with the teeth. So a word in that with that consonant is chich, which means bird.
So that is very interesting to listen about. Could you tell me a bit, not a background, a kind of introductory about indigenous peoples of Mexico in general, whether they have been recognized by the Mexican government, or how many people are there, how many are recognized, how many languages, and so forth?
Yeah. So currently in the country that is called Mexico, there are 68 people call them linguistic communities. I call them nations, indigenous nations. 68 different nations with different languages. Some are very small, like the Lacandon nation, or the Lacandon indigenous people. Probably has 300 members or so, and some of the other nations are big, like the Nahua nation, which has approximately 2 million people. Overall, indigenous populations in Mexico represent approximately between 10 and 15% of the total population of the country. So the country has 130 million people in a very big territory, 2 million square kilometers. So we represent approximately, so we're talking about approximately 13 million, 15 million indigenous people. And we mostly live in the southern part of Mexico, but there are also small indigenous nations in the north, especially in the border with the US. Sometimes indigenous people in that part live across the border, so some live in the US, some live in Mexico, and this is also true for people who live in the south. So we share a border with Guatemala in the south, so some indigenous people live on both sides of that border. Part of my people live also in Belize, which was a British colony. So they speak English, we speak Spanish, in addition to our native language, and that's that's how we are spread out. Historically, we have been, in different contexts. Historically, we have sometimes been the majority of the population in some regions. There are many important differences, but Mexico was a territory that was colonized by the Spanish in the 16th century, right? So you probably have heard about Hernan Cortés. He came to Mexico in 1519, and then after 2 years of campaigning, he managed to form strong alliances with several indigenous nations in the territory, and they defeated the main power player of the time, which was the Mexica or the Aztec, right? So you probably, if you know a little bit of history in the world, the Aztecs are, also very famous. They call themselves Mexica, actually. So the Mexica Empire fell.
They are also indigenous.
They were also indigenous, yes, okay. yes. But they had grown incredibly powerful before the arrival of the Europeans, and so they had a lot of enemies. In fact, they control mostly parts of what is today Mexico City, the central, the highlands of Mexico. But as I said, they had a lot of enemies. So they eventually were defeated by an alliance between other indigenous nations and the Spanish. The Spanish eventually were able to control that alliance and impose their rule. But the fall of the Aztec or Mexica Empire didn't mean that the whole territory of Mexico fell under control of the Spanish and its allies. It took several decades for the Spanish to even have, some shadow of a claim over the land that is now called Mexico. And in fact, recent historians are challenging the idea that they ever controlled the entire territory. So, but in many ways, the Spanish had to rely on their indigenous allies, which means that indigenous languages were, continue to be spoken for 300 years in, different parts of the territory. People, actually didn't experience significant change, other than being extracted resources in the form of tribute that will go to the kingdom of Spain. Gold, silver, things that the Europeans were interested in. And after 300 years, the country finally became independent. There was a multi-ethnic rebellion. Some of the people who rebelled against Spain were themselves Spanish, or descendants of Spanish that had been born in Mexico, but because they were not born in Europe, they had a lesser status than people who were born in Europe. So they felt really resentful, and they allied with others that had already mixed with the indigenous people, that we call the mestizo, mixed race. And then there were other, the majority of the population were still indigenous, but somehow under the yoke of the Spanish. So a multi-ethnic alliance finally managed to defeat the Spanish troops, the Spanish armies, in 1821. But the group that came out of that war victorious were, for the most part, descendants of Spanish. So they made Spanish the language of the new country. So in some ways, they declared that language to be the language of the nation. And but effectively, 70, almost 80% of the population still spoke their indigenous language, and that was the situation for most of the 19th century. At the beginning of the 20th century, we had a revolution against a very authoritarian regime that had emerged. This regime was trying to take the land, gradually displaced and took the land from many indigenous communities.
So do indigenous peoples have a private land or collective land?
For many centuries, indigenous people managed the lands collectively. Even before the colonization, there was no private property.
And today?
And today, because of this revolution, so this authoritarian regime wanted to privatize and take land from the indigenous people. So finally, again, a multi-ethnic alliance rebelled against this authoritarian figure, and then managed to introduce forms of recognition for collective lands. In 1917, a constitution was passed in Mexico that acknowledged this system of land tenure that included indigenous people, but also non-indigenous people who had become assimilated into the culture of the main culture of Spanish, Spanish language, and they had abandoned their connection to the languages and to the land, right? But they also wanted to still own the land collectively. So the Constitution recognized that, and since then, there have been many efforts to privatize the land, to continue taking the land from indigenous people, to displace them, in the 1950s, 1970s, there were a lot of mass development projects promoted by the government, and those projects were always created and took over the lands of indigenous people. So indigenous peoples sometimes their lands were flooded to create hydro dams for electricity to the big cities. So the people lost their lands, they were displaced, they were in some regions, non-indigenous people wanted the land, and they would sort of force them by with violence. And so anyway, so the history gets very complicated. But even today, with all this history, 52% of the land, according to the last survey, 52% of the land in Mexico is owned collectively, or there are communities who have collective titles to that land, who are either indigenous or non-indigenous.
I see. So when we talk about the definition of indigenous peoples, always the colonization actually comes as what you call the basis for the definitions as well. And also Nepal never had colonizations, but from the outside, that what we call is we had an internal colonization, what we call it. And indigenous peoples of Nepal, we are still struggling, are fighting against the government for preserving of languages, even to get the land rights, land titles, and so forth, or political rights. How about in Mexico? Though, as you said, 15 to 20% are indigenous peoples are there recognized by the constitution or government. As you also summarized some struggles that they have it in terms of the multi projects, all right, as you said. So, do they have a similar kind of struggles that we have? As I say, we're also struggling. Could you tell that sort of stories as well?
Yes. So, because of this complex history, we have always been the majority of the population in Mexico, right? So, there's for reasons that will be very difficult to explain today. There's always been a minority in control of the country, and in terms of the identity, it's also a very interesting question, because a lot of Mexicans are in fact they have indigenous heritage, right? So if we were to go back, I don't know, 5 generations back or 6 generations back, probably their ancestors would have been indigenous. But in the process of the last century, especially, through assimilation policies, through modernization policies, through the promotion of development, a lot of indigenous people began to renounce, began to leave their culture, their language, their communities, their connection with the territory. So one can say that if we look at the origin of the people in Mexico, 70% of the people are indigenous. But if we look at the continuity of a way of life, the continuity of language, the continuity of connection with the territory, then we can only speak about 10% or 15% of the population in Mexico. And these are the ones who have, so these communities who have resisted, who have remained, who have defended their way of looking at the world, are the ones that we today call indigenous, that are connected to languages and so. And we're still resisting because, as I said, we still have titles to, most of the land, most of the territory in the country called Mexico. And development projects are still coming to our lands. In the past, it was hydro dams, or it was oil exploration, or it was roads, or it was urbanization. So that process, in the last 40 years was very present in our lives. In more recent years, some of these projects have changed. So now they acquire, sometimes they take the form of creation of natural reserves, or creation of sustainable energy projects, right? Solar farms, eolic farms, or wind farms. Tourism has also become a way of dispossessing indigenous people, a way of taking over their lands, depriving them from access to territories. So the project still continues. The project of displacement and marginalization and assimilation continues, even though there have also been advancements of developments in favor of indigenous peoples. In 1994, a group of indigenous people declared war against the Mexican government. 1994. And this group was living in Chiapas. I don't know if you have heard about
Yes, Chiapas,
about
yes.
this struggle. The Zapatista, and the Zapatista, they didn't have a lot of military power. They when they came out, when they declared war to the Mexican government, for many in Mexico, for many people in Mexico, it was very clear that they were going to be crushed, and nobody wanted that. So the civil society in Mexico, indigenous and non-indigenous, came out and demanded a ceasefire, which happened very soon. So the Zapatista declared war against the Mexican government.
And they got the more rights now.
Exactly. On the 1st of January, then peace on the 12th of January. A
This,
ceasefire.
last year.
A ceasefire. No. That was in 1994.
That was in
Yeah.
back in 1994.
All in 1994.
So you said they waged war in 1994.
Yes, the
They-
war began. It only lasted 11 days.
Oh, okay.
Then there was a ceasefire. The Zapatista and the government came, started negotiations, and as part of that political process, the rights of indigenous people became recognized for the first time in the constitution of the country.
see.
But that only happened
Not only
seven.
for Zapatista, but also other indigenous peoples,
Exactly.
maybe in larger part.
Exactly.
So all of the issues that you, as you said in background, that you also teach the sociology, and these indigenous people's struggle are also a part of your teaching in the university.
Yes.
Or what do you cover in your research, in your study, in your teachings?
So I'm interested in the resistance that indigenous peoples continue to create, construct, but at the same time, I'm interested in how this resistance takes what form this resistance takes when it comes to technologies, right? And we know that our languages have been marginalized, our forms of knowing have been marginalized. So I'm curious about what possibilities the new technologies that we have today, the video cameras, the audio recorders, the internet, etc. What possibilities these technologies offer to indigenous people, and how indigenous people are transforming these technologies in a creative way.
Thank you, Hannah. We have reached almost at the end of the show. So I don't have any question to ask you, but I think we have discussed more and around the indigenous people's struggle, or indigenous peoples in general in Mexico, and your way of teaching our courses at sport. I don't have any questions, but if you want to say any last word or any message to the indigenous peoples of Nepal or to the world, at last I would like to give this.
Yes, I would like to greet all indigenous peoples in Nepal. We feel very connected. In many ways, we look the same. I have been welcomed in this country by all peoples, indigenous peoples especially. I know that your struggles are like our struggles, and we should create bridges of communication and mutual understanding and learn from each other.
Thank you, Hannah. Thank you so much for your time and also sharing your insights at the Dave's Hammer Show.
It's been a pleasure.
Thank you.
Dhanyavad.
So with this, we have reached at the end of the show, but our conversation continues. If you have any queries or feedbacks regarding the program, you can reach us at indigenous.television@gmail.com. Please join us next week in the brand new episodes of Dave's Hammer Show. By then, have a nice weekend. Namaste.